Hello and welcome. In this episode, we are going to talk about the development on the front lines in the Ukraine-Russia war. We are talking about high losses that have been occurred. We are talking about the mobilization and further political infighting that is getting published that we are hearing about. First, let's start off with some good news. Russia has started to verbally de-escalate when it's about nuclear weapons. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs published a statement that more or less said nuclear war can't be won and thus should be avoided by every means. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs also said that it's continuously in favor of reduction of nuclear weapon and restriction of nuclear weapons. Putin said on the 27th of October that Russia sees no need to use nuclear weapons within Ukraine. And Dmitry Medvedev, who is the head of the Russian Security Council and is one of the hardliners in this war, is also talking less and less about nuclear weapons. Seeing the verbal escalation in the past, it is increasingly obvious that the mentions of nuclear weapons were maybe an attempt to coerce Ukraine into start up negotiations after the annexation of the territory, in hope that this will make Ukraine stop the war and basically hand over the annexed territories. The reported discussions about the modus operandi of the usage of nuclear weapons that were reported in the international media supposedly happened without Putin present, and they maybe have to be seen in the context of the question how it's actually done, because the situation now has obviously changed with Russia annexing several territories of Ukraine that are currently contested, where Ukraine is holding this territory. This could in theory affect the Russian nuclear doctrine. So in this regard, it kind of made sense that on the Russian side there was some discussion over it, but as it seems increasingly, it was not a discussion in a sense of should we use nuclear weapons. China's Xi Jinping and also the foreign minister said in the past weeks that they are also, China is basically against nuclear threats and they are unacceptable. Especially, and usage is even more unacceptable. This shows that China is also using its influence, as I've said in the past, and as I'm going to say in that video, that is now being like superseded by the events that is going to be published tomorrow about Russia's nuclear weapons, that the influence of China, that for China nuclear weapons use would be disastrous and unacceptable, and thus Russia can't really afford to do that. The Ukraine Supreme Commander Valery Salushny has said the Ukrainian side has shot down 278 planes, and he compared it with 119 planes lost in 10 years of war in Afghanistan. The fact is, though, that the 278 shot down planes are Ukrainian claims. The only thing that is proven are 63 combat planes and 57 helicopters, as well as 141 drones. So even if we add it all up and include cheap drones and mix them up with highly expensive multi-role combat planes, probably costing close to $100 million, we still don't reach the 278 that Ukraine is claiming. Obviously, there's a difference when it comes to proven losses and to actual losses, but the difference in Ukrainian claims to what is proven is massive. GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, is saying that Russia has by now used up 80% of its precision weapons and that only 120 Iskander are left, as they are also part of the nuclear deterrence. Iskander can be used with nuclear warheads. We should not expect too many of them, to see too many of them in continued use during that war. The former DNR, so-called Donetsk People's Republic's security minister, and he's now commanding troops on the front line, Alexander Khodorkovsky, has said that 60% of their losses, of the Russian losses since Mariupol, happened through friendly fire. Now that number is immense, 60%. It seems it should be massively too big. that more than half of the own troops are killed by own artillery, it would be exceptional. A certain amount of friendly fire is unfortunately normal in war, but any number close to that would be unheard of, would be probably close to without example, except especially over a sustained campaign. Generally, it shows a massive lack of Russian skills in command and control. But why he would say 60%, I can't really say. It might be one of those Russian things where they think their own incompetence is a better explanation than Ukrainian competence, like we've seen with the airfields in Crimea or with Moscow, where people start smoking and then blow up their own devices, their own places. So I can't really put this into perspective, but 60% seems massively overblown. But even if it's only half as much, it would still indicate a drastic problem within Russian command and control, because friendly fire can be reduced to a vast degree if you know and actually control where your troops are, so the artillery, so your troops don't fire at each other. On the Eastern Front, we have a report about a Russian attack on Zybune, which should be more or less here somewhere. Here. So the Russians came over the border and attacked in that direction. They were repulsed. This attack has again to be seen like the former attacks we talked about in Ternova in the past weeks. This is a fixing attack. The Russians are attacking here to show the Ukrainians we could come across the border at all times, so you better leave troops here and don't use them at other places. That has to be seen as that, and we have to say it's perfectly working for the Russians in this regard, as this is a very weird war where only one side is crossing the border and the other one isn't. The Russians are saying Ukrainians are still attacking more or less between Svatove and Kremina. Some attacks are a little bit northern of that. The Russians are also reporting an attack in the direction of Nizhnya Luvanka, but more or less along that line. We don't see any proven successes, any proven advances. The Russians themselves are attacking more or less west of Kremina, like in this, more or less along this line. They're attacking to the west there again. We don't really have great successes. We don't see any movement on the ground that is proven. The Russian opposition media, though, is saying, and we have something here that is being spread around now, that in Makivka, 500 mobilized men have been killed. Let me see where Makivka was. It's somewhere here. No. Mykolaiivka, probably. I saw it here. No, here it is. Makivka. So here, along the front line, 500 Russian mobilized men were killed in a very short time. They tried to dig in, and I put it here, and you can stop the video to read it yourself, and I'll put the link in the description of, I'll put the link on the website mgeschichte.com, where you see the link in the description. So more or less they were trying to dig in and were shelled the whole time by the Ukrainian side, and whenever they got out of cover, drones spotted them and they started shelling them again. So more than 500 men, or up to 500 men, roughly that number, was killed in that one day, and that obviously is creating shockwaves throughout Russia. The Russian Ministry of Defense is saying, wait, somehow I think the cat has somehow deleted it again. The Ministry of Defense said ludicrous numbers, that they lost only less than 1% of their troops, and less than 7% were wounded within the past 10 days. So the reports by the Russian Ministry of Defense is massively different to what is being reported here. Yeah. I think that was it, or it was by something else. No, it's actually, I'm sorry, my mistake. This time Siegfried is innocent. It's actually a second event with high losses. Where this is done. The Russians are now claiming they have entered Bilohorivka. The Ukrainians confirm that there's fighting, that there was Russian attacks on Bilohorivka. We have not confirmation whether they've actually entered the town or not. It might be, I just can't confirm it as of now. Further south, we have the usual attacks from the line down Bakhmut to more or less a little bit west of Vuhledar. This time with some movement though. We have the interior minister of the so-called Luhansk People's Republic is saying that Wagner mercenaries have breached the first line of defense that should be east of Bakhmut. The Russians are also saying they've now captured Ivangrad. They claimed it captured before, but it might have been retaken by the Ukrainians. We have image proof that they are at least inside of the town. Whether they control 100% of it is not confirmed, but there's definitely still fighting going on about Opytne here. The further south, we have the attacks around Avdiivka. We now have the so-called Donetsk People's Republic saying that they captured the Ukrainian positions at the airport of Donetsk. They've published a video. It seems to be more or less true. So it's a high likelihood that they actually finally, after 8 years of fighting, were able to capture the positions at the airport that were held since 2014 or 15 by the Ukrainians here. The Russians are also saying they captured territory in the direction of Opytne and Vodiane, so more or less here. This is not confirmed. And we have reports about attacks on Novomykhailivka, south of Marinka. This is here, in this direction. They seem to have been unsuccessful. Also, heavy attacks continuing in the direction of Pavlivka. Ukrainians say they defeated them, and Russian sources are actually saying it's going really bad there. It's pro-Russian Telegram that is saying it's really going bad there. The troops are exhausted, and they should be rotated out, but there's nothing left to rotate them. In the pro-Russian media, pro-Russian circles, there's also a letter that is circulating. According to that, the Russian forces of the 155th Marine Infantry Brigade has been used on the attacks at Pavlivka, and it has been more or less expended. The letter is saying the brigade lost within 4 days 300 men. Lost means total casualties, so missed, fallen, and wounded. That's as well as half of its material, so tanks, IFVs, etc. Inside of the letter, they asked the governor of Primorsky Krai to start an independent investigation to find out what actually happened there, what made the military act in a way that occurred those losses. And they were heavily criticizing the commander of the Eastern Military District, Lieutenant General Rustam Muradov, the commander of the 155th Marine Infantry Brigade, Colonel Surab Akhmedov, and the head of General Staff, the Chief of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, are all being attacked in that letter. And that's where I want what I thought my poor Siegfried had mistakenly deleted when he stepped over the keyboard. The Russian Ministry of Defense was in a rare occasion actually responded to accusations from military bloggers, and they were saying less than 1% of the brigade has been killed and less than 7% of them have been wounded within the last 10 days. And it's exactly the opposite. The Ukrainians have suffered heavy losses, and the Ukrainians have basically started the letter, have spread it around. They more or less say it's Ukrainian propaganda. According to the fact that we hear about heavy fighting at Pavlivka for a week, or maybe more than that now, that they only lost 1% of their personnel and fallen seems highly unlikely. So we might find out that the Russian Ministry of Defense has lied once more. And should the military bloggers find out, that will not be of help when it comes to the Russian Military of Defense in its fighting against the Siloviki around Kadyrov and Prigozhin. On the southern front, we have actually a Russian attack. We have an attack on Mali Sherbaki, which is here. Mali, Sherbaki, and Sherbaki. So in this direction there has been a Russian attack, and we actually have a video of Ukrainian special forces that have crossed the Dnieper. I have that here. We can play it. So what we can see here is the forces getting ready. You can see them getting on a boat, thermal imaging so good nighttime equipment. It says it's National Police of Ukraine Special Forces from them. We see them on the reservoir here in boats, operating in the darkness and in either dusk or dawn. Looks to me like ribs, that they are using ribs here to move around. We see silencers, etc. So in general, the special forces are obviously better equipped than usually. And what was interesting here from a helicopter also, apparently with air support here, and there is one imaging by explosions or fighting on the background, and this here, what we can see here, those two chimneys have been localized in Nehodar, Zaporizhzhia. So that's at least close to the Russian-controlled side of the Dnieper reservoir. We see the Ukrainians operating here. We see them shoot at the border. So maybe the Russians, in their claims that they defeat Ukrainian attempts to cross the reservoir, I've said it in the past, we already had past videos of Ukrainian special forces on the other side of the river. The Russians might be right, at least when it comes to them defeating or when it comes to them reporting that the Ukrainian side tried to cross the reservoir. Whether they defeat them every time, whether they defeat them with those high losses that they claim, is obviously quite a different story. We have also good news from the International Atomic Energy Agency. That is that the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Nehodar is now reconnected to the electric grid. We have that, I don't know how many times already happening, that it's being disconnected and has to run on its generators, which is needed for active cooling for the fuel rods that still produce massive amount of heats even weeks after the power plant has been shut down. So whoever is shelling it there seems to be intent of keeping the other side active and on its toes, but we don't have any serious reports about attacks on the nuclear reactor buildings. So it seems to be single or small amount of artillery, mostly just cutting the electric lines. As we said in the past, both sides accuse each other, and one side probably has a little bigger incentive to do that than the other, but not much of a point of guessing here. We have some images in the past that shows the propulsion unit of a MLRS rocket that clearly came from the Russian side inside of the nuclear power plant, but that would mean the question when it has separated from the warhead. That's not perfectly clear from my side to determine that this was an attack on the power plant. But if we see the incentives, then obviously Ukraine doesn't really have much to gain if they create a second Chernobyl on their own territory that will mostly hit their territory. While the wind might blow some of the dust into Russia, the majority of the radiation will be within Ukraine and within Ukrainian waters, which is likely necessary for millions of people to rely on their drinking water. Whereas the Russians, by threatening nuclear attacks, they are to some degree, and if you follow the social media channels, they are successful to some degree to paint the Ukrainian side as irresponsible, attacking a nuclear power plant, etc. So while I don't see any solid proof, in my mind, it's probably more the Russians, more likely that the Russians are doing that shelling, especially as the shelling doesn't seem to be intent on actually destroying the power plant. In that context, it might make sense, but obviously you might be of a different opinion. You might see that differently, and the discussions about that will be very interesting. So I'm looking forward to your input in the comment section. In Kherson, we have the usual attacks being reported by the Ukrainian side, so lines of communication, logistics, command centers, troop concentration, ferries, pontoons, ammunition dumps, etc., etc., etc. Nothing special here. According to Russian sources, the Russians are saying they finished the official evacuations from the right side of the river, so the northwestern side of the river. as of now, it's the only evacuations that continue are civilian private evacuations. We also have reports that the Russians are still fortifying the right bank of the river, so no sign of an immediate withdrawal. Whereas on the left side, we also have reports about fortifications, and we even have some geolocated satellite pictures here. Here you can see the trenches that are being set up in, where is it, Kakhovka. We see them here being built. We have the next one is from Zaporizhzhia. Here again, you can see the typical positions for infantry lines, and that could be artillery. I'm not completely sure. Obviously, the resolution is pretty bad, but it could be artillery positions. And finally, we have this here, obviously defending into the direction of the water in Ivanivka, and that's fairly interesting actually, because the three positions were here, Kakhovka, Zaporizhzhia is here, but Ivanivka is here. So they seem to be preparing in case the Ukrainians enter Yahorlik Bay and do an amphibious landing here, which is quite impressive in my mind, because I would not expect the Ukrainians to seriously consider an amphibious landing there. But at the same time, it also shows how they see the Black Seas fleet being neutralized, that any amphibious landing here can actually be serious in minds of the Russian side, that the Ukrainians might actually succeed in that. So they have to prepare for that. In this regard, it's fairly interesting. The Ukrainians also saying in Nova Kakhovka, in the town itself, the Russians are preparing everything for the defense and are now mining the town. And there's been fairly interesting, because they mentioned that they place explosives in underground positions, for instance in the sewage system. Obviously, if they have weeks and months of time, they can place huge amounts of explosives under crossroads. So in case the Ukrainians enter the town, they might just have to hit a switch for a cable that's buried deeply underground, and thus completely safe from Ukrainian interference, which might blow up a complete Ukrainian position. So entering Nova Kakhovka should be extremely problematic for the Ukrainians, and we can see that as the dam is likely not going to be blown up, or even if it's blown up, it's a potential crossing point for Ukrainian infantry. The Russians are now preparing a heavy, solid defense on this side of the river. The Ukrainian side is also saying the Russians continue destroying boats. And the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, is saying the abandoned houses from the evacuees are systematically being plundered. So house by house, they are emptied of everything of value, obviously including the famous washing machines, and all of this is being brought over the river right now. In Kherson, we have in the north here, we have surprisingly little attacks reported, and even in the south, it's fairly quiet apart from shelling. The Russians are saying there's a big troop concentration being built up, and there are some fightings close to the border of the oblasts, the two. So it should be more or less here at Posad Pokrovske, where in the past the Russians have also reported Ukrainian troop concentrations and Ukrainian preparations to advance. And now our little stream technician has arrived, as some of you might be able to see on the map. It's good, my boy. Okay. We have news from partisans, if we want to call it like this. We have here a video that's been made of, as they are described, anarchists that set places on fire in Russia, that control like electric switchboards, etc., that control the Russian railway line, to make it more difficult to resupply. And we have the report of the supreme judge in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, Alexander Nikulin. He has been attacked he has been ambushed and seems to be still be alive, even though he was heavily wounded. That were the reports I read, and he was the judge who sentenced several of the international volunteers that were captured by the Russians to death. He was then attacked. There's some arguing it might be infighting within the Donetsk People's Republic. We have numerous reports in the past months of infighting inside of the two People's Republics, that supposedly they are fighting for power there and thus are killing each other. That's at least what we often hear from the Ukrainian side when they decline, when they say we haven't done an attack that has been reported. We now have a report from Kherson when we go to the mobilization here, and it's I'll put it here and you can see the automatic translation. Up to 2,000 soldiers supposedly participated in a protest. An officer has been threatened with violence. One report was talking about a colonel, another about a brigadier general. So I'm not completely sure one of which, or it might have been several officers, likely though, and they were threatened. They have been massively insulted, as you can see, and they were criticized because basic supply like food and water or heating materials were not available for the fresh mobilized men, and that's another sign of the lack of discipline and morale inside of the Russian mobilized men. The Russian offices, the Russian government institutions supposedly are setting up preparations to investigate Russian men that are returning from other countries, draft dodgers or mobilization dodgers. Supposedly the FSB is going to try to prosecute them for working together with foreigners, but obviously it should be questionable how many of those men will actually return. I guess it's to some degree also a question of money, whether they can find work or whether they can go back, but that the majority is not going to return until their war is over should be more or less expected. The GUR is saying that's the Ukrainian military intelligence, and it's about time that I say it in this video too. When we talk about the government or generally news from one of the active sides in a war, we should take it with a generous grain of salt. So we shouldn't take it too literally, but the GUR, the Ukrainian military intelligence, is saying the number of infectious diseases, specifically of the respiratory system, is massively growing among the Russian troops within Belarus. The majority of them are freshly mobilized men, and they supposedly are housed in tents without proper heating, so they are already suffering drastically under the weather. And the GUR is also saying like the Belarusian doctors are completely overwhelmed, and the Russians are now sending additional medical units because the soldiers are reaching a degree of sickness that is problematic. We have further information, news reports about the dramatic lack of discipline and morale among the Russian mobilized men. We are having among the mobilized men, there's a report in Belgorod from 350 Russian mobilized men completely drunk that arrived at the train station, and police was unable to get them under control. We have reports from Luhansk that mobilized men are being imprisoned under horrible conditions because they refuse to fight, and they are being threatened with execution by their officers. We also have news from the volunteer unit Botur, that's from the Republic of Sakha, and it returned home with 13 men out of 105 that went to Ukraine. Let's go to the political sphere when that little saboteur lets me. Prigozhin is continuing to improve his position. He was visiting Kursk province and met local businessmen to create a people's militia. Towards the media, he was implying at the same time that Wagner is part of it was on Russia's Unity Day, and he was implying that him and Wagner, his mercenaries, are the ones that actually keep Russia united. The insider is also the media. The insider has reported 500 of his prisoners have already fallen. So the convicts he was recruiting, and Wagner in total has lost 800 to 1,000 men, which would be, in my mind, surprisingly little concerning the amount of attacks that have been reported recently. Prigozhin has by now confirmed that Wagner is setting up training centers for people's militias in Kursk and Belgorod. What's up? Can I access the mouse, please? That is in the north here. We see Belgorod here, and Kursk is here. He's setting up, Wagner is setting up training centers there. And he emphasized that the people's militia that are going to be built there are outside of the structure of the Ministry of Defense. So he's basically increasing his force structure massively. He's continuing to do it. He was talking to RFE-RL, so Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and he said, of course, he's getting involved in the US midterm elections. He's interfering with them. He emphasized that he has interfered in the past, that he's currently doing it, and that he's continuing to do it. Whether that's actually the truth is a different question, but it has to be seen with the goal of undermining the US democracy. Obviously, in case of a massive win by one side today, the other side now has the reason to claim Russian interference in this, and at the same time Prigozhin is presenting him at home as an international actor, somebody who is furthering Russia's interest abroad, internationally abroad as well. That should also help him to sharpen his profile and to improve his position within the Russian information sphere. There are also reports about massive continuous filtration measures happening inside of Ukraine. Filtration is what's being called when the Russians are basically seeping through Ukrainians to find persons that are on certain lists or that fit certain criteria to be separated, filtered out from the rest. And the Ukrainian General Staff is saying that they are being sent into torture camps among that. So from the Ukrainian side, again, the accusation of massive torture. Other than that, we have reports, dozens of new reports, not dozens, but several new reports about hundreds of Ukrainian children being sent to Russia out of the various reasons, among them vacation, relaxation, education, but also some of them are explicitly being sent to Russia to be adopted. Whether those are ones that have been taken away from parents or that are being considered orphans is obviously not completely clear yet, but it continues that Russia is more or less getting Ukrainian children spread out inside of Russia and giving them to Russian parents to gain control of them. When we come to support, we have one report here about massive problems for satellite communication Starlink. 1,300 satellite dishes from Starlink that are being operated by the Ukrainian military have been turned off. Those are the ones that were bought with from Great Britain, and the bills have not been paid, and obviously Starlink as a commerce has to run its business, so they seem to have turned off the satellite dishes because of the lack of payment. We have here a report. As said, I'm going to put all of those links on the website, but here they analyzed an Iranian drone, and 67 of its parts were coming from the US, 14 from 14 different companies. And finally, this is something I can't really tell you, so I'm interested in your opinion in the comments. Maybe some of you can identify them, but those are trucks that are being handed over to the Russians that are going to the front line here. And while they look very antiquated, that is looking like some 80s material. I'm not completely sure if the Russians are not just continuing that old design more or less in the same way. So whether those might actually be fairly new trucks, buses, and SUVs. in this regard, obviously, it would be highly interesting if some of you could enlighten us whether this is a sign of the Russians grabbing antiquated material out of civilian hands. Here it was said they raided local dealerships to get this, but it's highly interesting, obviously, for us whether this is a sign of them already lacking even fairly modern equipment. And obviously, the older the equipment is, the more maintenance it needs, and the more likely it is that it breaks down. That's it from me for now. I hope it was interesting for you, despite that little stream technician saboteur being here. This channel is only possible because of the support from viewers like you. I want to thank everyone who already supported the channel, and if you want to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much. But you can also support the channel by commenting. Starting discussions is obviously really good for the algorithm. Don't forget the like button, and if you haven't subscribed yet, I want to invite you to subscribe. Don't forget the bell icon, and if you want to, you can obviously recommend the channel to friends and acquaintances to help it grow. That's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.